My own interest is less in whether or not the photograph is true or false, but why we have such an investment, almost emotional, I've argued almost theological. It's as if surely the photograph is going to show us the reality of the world that somehow we cannot get somewhere else.
This is bringing to my mind a scene from an Anand Patwardhan film where there is a local woman, a Rajasthani woman in the film who is showing the filmmaker a photograph and saying, this is, just to tell you what sati is, it's the practice of burning a widow, right, at her husband's funeral. And she shows him an image in which it's kind of manipulated to show that she ascends to the heaven from that funeral pyre, and she insists on the reality. She says that because this is a photograph, it is true. And so, and he, as a rationalist, is trying to show her the signs of manipulation. And so the faith, I think, then becomes the subject of the photograph there, right? Like this is why we grapple with whether a photograph is true or not true. Or also in the time of deep fakes and absolute sort of, lack of trust with the news that we see.
No, but don't you think, I mean, this is the thing, in terms of we three, what is our role in society? It's surely to encourage our students, you might say, the next generation of lookers, to have an intelligent skepticism about what they see, and indeed about what they want to see. Because what you're talking about, again, is as you say, a faith, a belief outside of rational evidence. What I would say is we all have such desires. Who doesn't want to have faith in something? But we have to be skeptical if we want to invest those desires in photograph. And that is even the case with the photographs that we usually take for granted to be indeed true, that are indeed authentic. And for example, let's say Dorothea Lange's photograph of the migrant mother, that we have a deep investment in, that this represents a particular person under particularly difficult circumstances, but also symbolically millions of other people that in the Great Depression were suffering in various ways. But again, if you actually look at that photograph and study that photograph, it's been manipulated in all sorts of ways, from, of course, its first exposure through to her manipulation of the negative, and then the very many different contexts in which it's been printed with different captions and information around it, which have made it change meaning over many years. That is the nature of truths. They are malleable, and we need to be constantly questioning them.
Also wanted to ask you about this process of reading, right, through which all of photography is opened up. And especially when you were talking about certain retro-modern kind of post-photographic practices, right, that and you kind of insisted on avoiding the term abstraction in your sort of conversation with Beta. And what I wanted to ask is, there is a sort of dependence on a certain critical reading that accompanies those photographs, without which they do descend into sort of some realm of abstraction, right? And just what the role of text is within the photographic image.
So again, I'd say the presumed distinction between realism and abstraction is another one of these binaries that we need to question. Is photograph a realist medium or a mode of abstraction? I think we should keep the question alive, no matter what the photograph, because it enables a certain kind of critical conversation around photographs. Well, it was certainly said in the 1930s that, you know, the new illiterate is going to be those people who are unable to caption photographs. So I'd say, of course, photographs have always come with texts of one sort or another, either literally or text that we bring to them in our heads. So the relationship between an image and a piece of writing continues to be of vital importance. And again, those of us who are writers rather than photographers, we have the opportunity to reframe photographs with critical thinking. I do think that captions and texts remain crucially important to the way we understand photographs, but I also think we have to have a very broad understanding of what this word text might entail, because it could also include, for example, the conventions of presentation, white walls, frames, mats, labels, all of these kinds of things also are forms of text.
Mm-hmm. This sort of crisis of massification that he was talking about, yes. I'm wondering if it's really a crisis of text as well, like the paratext of images and now escapes us in some way, or like we don't know how to read them.
So yeah, the conversation you're referring to, Juan Foncaberta worries aloud, you might say, about the effects of the hyperinflation of photographs that we encounter today, where once they might have been made in their hundreds, now they're made in their billions. And surely, he says, this is overwhelming us, but also undercutting the power of photography, the power of photographs to affect people, to move people, to even reach people. We're simply deluged, and therefore no single photograph can ever sort of have an impact on our consciousness. And one of the things I say to him is, well, I can understand why he's worrying about it, because he's a photographer. But I'm a historian, and so I have to be more dispassionate about it. That hyperinflation is indeed a fact of life. It doesn't fill me with anxiety, though, except insofar as an historian, it's difficult to grapple with the sheer number of images that are made today. Now, in that sense, as you say, the difficulty of adding, you might say, a critical framing to photography becomes more difficult when there are just so damn many of them. On the other hand, most of them are much the same. That is, yes, there's a trillion selfies, but you don't really need to talk about all trillion of them. Really, any one or perhaps two or three are enough to represent the whole mass. So in that sense, I think we still have the capacity to make critical comments, even on that mass of photographs. And one of the things I point out to him is, fortunately, there are interesting artists out there, including Fontcomberta himself, but many others, who are doing a lot of that critical work on behalf of us historians. They are culling examples from the herd, you might say, and sort of isolating them and making them visible to us. I'd say the bigger issue would be, how can whatever I write reach an audience that is bombarded with so much other information? And that's why it's heartening to hear that people in South Asia are reading things that I might write in New Zealand or Oxford. It's a strange effect. I've often said it's like you're putting a message in a bottle and casting it out there in the ocean, and then you're always surprised to hear, oh, it washed up on the shore of India and somebody actually read that note. I mean, that is gratifying, and it shows that even in the sort of blizzard of information that we're all bombarded with now, it is possible to reach audiences still. But that small audience then ripples out to their students and the students of those students and so on. And hopefully, even within the small world in which we operate, we can make a difference. And this comes back to my first point, rethinking how a history of photography might function, how it might be structured, the kind of questions that it might ask, the kind of materials that it might choose to look at. This is a microcosm of a much bigger political debate. And within the little world that we have any control over, this is a debate we should be having.
Thank you. As you mentioned, a little bit earlier, how do we sort of contend with this idea that the image is real, and why are we so focused on it? And it just made me think about the last year and sort of this whole thematic of absence, the lack of images, not being able to see certain realities. And certainly talking from a political register, even like interpersonal media like Zoom, just in the last week, it's been announced by our government, will be regulated probably in the future. Right. And it sort of makes one think about what kinds of images we're going to end up seeing and what kind of filters will be attached to those images. And so it for me also comes down to a sort of evocatory again of your title, Negative and Positive, read now as presence and absence. And I wanted just to ask you whether there was certain images within your book, within this book, that you thought sort of went between the two. They tried to show by not showing, or they showed something that was entirely something absent, and one was able to penetrate them enough to read through both.
One of the chapters that I enjoyed writing, it was originally a catalogue essay for an Italian artist named Linda Nagler. And the work was 1,000 vernacular photographs that she presented at the Venice Biennale as part of an exhibition curated by Cindy Sherman. And the 1,000 photographs were all of so-called hidden mothers, of parents, mothers and fathers, but they're always referred to as hidden mother photographs, who hide behind cloths in order to hold their child steady in order for the photograph to be made. Now, I found these photographs fascinating, but again, an artist sort of brought them to my attention because here we have an example where the mother makes herself invisible in order to make the child visible. But in making herself invisible, covering herself with a cloth and holding the child in her lap for the camera, in the present moment, she makes herself all the more visible by making herself invisible. So our eye flickers back and forth between the visible presence of the child and the making invisible of the mother. And I tried to argue in my essay that in some ways these photographs, which of course are simply made by ordinary people in the 1860s and 70s, speak to the situation of women and of motherhood, the sort of societal space that motherhood has been given in our culture, in which the mother simply becomes a vehicle for the child and indeed for the father of the child. So here's an example where I think a critical way of thinking about otherwise ordinary photographs opens up a kind of fissure within the presumed dichotomies that that photograph reiterates. So that almost unconsciously it opens up and makes more visible precisely the politics of the photograph itself. So I'm not sure if it's exactly the perfect example of what you're talking about. I'm always interested when governments want to control vehicles of communication because it suggests that they've actually been quite effective, and that therefore they now need to be brought under some sort of control. The anxiety of government points to the success of the media.
Yeah.
And I think, we have to have some optimism that whatever controls are brought in, people will find ways around them, as they have in China, for example. Despite all of the censorship that the Chinese government has brought to the internet, Chinese youth has found ways around it. So, I'm confident questioning will still occur no matter what controls are imposed. And that if we continue to insist on that kind of critical questioning of the world around us, beginning with the critical questioning of even the most ordinary of photographs, these kinds of binary oppositions and the politics that come with them will be able to break those down. But it's going to be a continuous process. It's never going to come to some ideal ending.
Thank you, Geoffrey, so very much. It sort of makes me distinctly aware of sort of the cultural histories. As you mentioned, the women, it reminded me of a particular series we have over here in which the male had to actually leave the room in order for the females to be photographed. And in a way, he would pose certain, the male photographer would end up posing certain characters in front of the lens. He would then sort of leave the room, the women would appear, a woman, a sort of assistant, would take, the shutter off the camera and then put it back on. And so, the idea of them being sort of intermittent and sort of having not seen one another but taken a photograph through one another was kind of interesting to me.
Let's just take that as a metaphor, because here I am speaking to you, you're interviewing me, but I'm looking forward to the day when that is reversed. Because I would say, as my final word, is that what is needed is we need to have more South Asian voices in the history of photography, speaking to the history of photography. And I'm looking forward to the day when learning about South Asian photography, through indigenous scholarship, if you like,